In Chapter 1, Kira Voss and Marcus Wu hunted in the shadows of Jupiter's belt. Killers for hire. Professionals who executed a contract with surgical precision, 3 bodies, 0 witnesses, and a stolen confession that revealed 4.3 trillion credits flowing to coordinates that don't exist. But while they planned their next job, another story was unfolding. 16 days before Ganymede, on Mars, a disgraced accountant is about to discover the same pattern Kira and Marcus touched. The same impossible symbol. The same conspiracy that reaches deeper than anyone imagines. David Chen was brilliant once, the coalition's best forensic analyst, until he exposed corruption that reached too high, and the system destroyed him for it. Now, exiled to Mars, calculating profit margins for criminals, he thinks he's surviving. He's wrong. When David finds anomalies hidden in financial records, a pattern spanning the solar system, pointing to 4.3 trillion credits and a symbol that shouldn't exist, he becomes a piece in a game far larger than corporate conspiracy. A game played by forces that have been waiting, watching, preparing. Content warning. This chapter contains adult themes, sexual content, violence, psychological manipulation, and cosmic horror. Recommended for mature audiences only. Welcome to Yardman, Cosmos, 3000. This is Chapter 2, The Accountant's Error. Part 1, The Pattern. David Chen had always been good with numbers. Not just competent, exceptional. The kind of good that let him see patterns in financial data the way a conductor hears music in orchestral chaos. The kind of good that had propelled him from a mid-level analyst position to Deputy Director of Economic Policy for the Earth Governance Coalition in less than 8 years. The kind of good that had gotten him exiled to Mars. He sat now in a rented office in Olympus City, a glorified closet with a view of the rust-colored waste beyond the dome, staring at spreadsheets for a small-time smuggling operation. The work was beneath him, calculating profit margins on stolen medical supplies, laundering money through shell corporations in the Belt colonies, finding tax loopholes that let criminals keep their blood money. It was honest work, at least. More honest than what he'd done for the coalition. 3 years ago, David had been untouchable. Deputy Director Chen, the man who'd cracked the Titan mining cartels, who'd exposed the Belt separatist funding networks, who'd traced illegal arms sales through 17 layers of shell corporations to their source. The coalition's golden boy. The uncorruptible bureaucrat who proved the system could work. Then he had made the mistake of being too good at his job. It started with a routine audit of a shipping conglomerate called Prometheus Distribution. On paper, they were legitimate: medical supplies, construction materials, food shipments to the outer colonies. Nothing suspicious. But David had noticed something odd in their tax filings. Not fraud exactly, just patterns. Money moving in ways that didn't quite make sense if you were running a normal business. So he dug deeper. What he found was a syndicate that made the Belt separatists look like amateur shoplifters. Prometheus Distribution was a front for an operation that moved everything from weapons to banned pharmaceuticals to human trafficking victims. And the money. David had traced billions flowing through accounts on Earth, Mars, Europa, and stations in the Belt that officially didn't exist. The syndicate had protection, of course. Operations that large always did. But David hadn't expected the protection to go as high as it did. Coalition ministers, senators from Earth's regional governments, military procurement officers, judges, police commissioners, names that appeared in news feeds and gave speeches about law and order and the rule of civilized society. All of them on Prometheus Distribution's payroll. David had done what he was supposed to do. He'd compiled the evidence, built an airtight case, and presented it to his superiors. He'd expected commendations, maybe a promotion, certainly justice. Instead, he'd gotten a midnight visit from 2 coalition internal security officers. They'd been polite, professional. They'd sat in his apartment, his old apartment, the nice one in the coalition administrative complex on Earth, and explained very carefully how things worked. How politically complicated certain investigations were. How exposing the Prometheus network would destabilize multiple planetary governments. How sometimes the greater good required accepting smaller evils. David had refused to drop the investigation. The officers had looked at each other, then back at him, and their politeness had acquired an edge sharp enough to cut bone. Deputy Director Chen, one of them had said, "You're a brilliant analyst. You see patterns others miss. But you're missing the most important pattern of all. The people protecting Prometheus are the same people who sign your paychecks, who approves your security clearance, who decides whether you're a valued asset or a dangerous liability. David had understood the threat. He'd also understood that backing down would mean becoming complicit. So he'd made copies of everything, encrypted, distributed across multiple secure locations, and he'd gone to the media. That's when his life ended. The story never ran. Every journalist he contacted suddenly stopped returning his messages. His evidence disappeared from secure servers. His personal accounts were frozen, then mysteriously drained. Coalition Internal Security launched an investigation into David Chen himself. Turned out he'd been embezzling funds, falsifying reports, accepting bribes from the very criminals he claimed to be investigating. The evidence was impeccable. Documents with his digital signature. Financial records showing deposits to his accounts. Even recorded conversations where his voice discussed illegal transactions, synthesized David knew, but perfect down to the acoustic fingerprint. He'd been given a choice: accept exile to Mars with a minimal severance package, or face trial for crimes that carried a minimum 20-year sentence in a coalition prison facility. David had chosen Mars. For the first year, he'd been angry, bitter. He'd tried to find ways to expose the truth, to get his evidence to someone who would listen. But every attempt had been blocked, intercepted, or resulted in the people he contacted suddenly experiencing career-ending scandals or unfortunate accidents. Eventually, David had understood. You didn't fight people with that much power. You survived them. You kept your head down, did the work nobody else wanted, and tried not to think too hard about the fact that the system you'd believed in was rotten from the foundation up. So here he was, Olympus City, Mars, calculating profit margins for criminals who at least had the decency to admit what they were. It was honest work, more honest than what the coalition had become. David's fingers moved across the holographic display, numbers cascading into columns that made sense only to him. The smuggling rings books were a mess, deliberately so most likely. Too many transactions were carried out through too many intermediaries. Classic money laundering structure, designed to obscure the trail. But David could see through it. He always could. The office was quiet except for the hum of air processors and the occasional distant rumble of terraforming equipment. Mars never truly slept. The massive atmospheric processors worked around the clock, slowly, incrementally making the planet habitable. A project that would take centuries. A monument to human ambition and stubbornness. David appreciated the symbolism. He too was working on a long-term project, surviving in a system designed to crush him. 3 hours into the audit, he found the first anomaly. It was small. Insignificant, really. A decimal point shifted 2 places in a fuel transaction dated 6 months ago. The kind of error that happens when someone's tired or distracted. Except the transaction had been flagged as verified by 3 separate accountants, each of whom should have caught the mistake. David highlighted the entry, made a note to ask his client about it, and continued working. The Martian sunset painted the sky outside his window in shades of pink and orange, the thin atmosphere creating colors Earth's thicker air could never match. Beautiful in its way. Alien. A reminder that humanity was still visitors here, still dependent on domes and life support, and the fragile membrane between survival and suffocation. 2 hours later, as the sky darkened to deep purple, he found another anomaly. Different transactions, different dates, but the same type of error. Another decimal point shifted exactly 2 places. And again, flagged as verified by multiple people who should have known better. That was when David's instincts started whispering. He'd learned to trust those instincts during his years with the coalition, back when he was tracking illegal arms sales and corporate embezzlement schemes that spanned multiple planets. Pattern recognition was his gift. The ability to see the shape of things hidden in noise and chaos. These weren't random errors. They were deliberate. David leaned back in his chair, fingers steepled, mind already racing ahead. If these were deliberate errors, what was their purpose? Skimming? Too obvious, the amounts were tiny. Communication? Possible. A code embedded in financial noise, meant to be found by someone who knew how to look. Someone like him. He opened a secondary workspace and began pulling every transaction from the smuggling rings database. Thousands of entries spanning 2 years. The data flowed across his displays in rivers of numbers, beautiful and terrible in their complexity. David had always loved this part. The hunt. The moment when chaos began to resolve into order, when the hidden patterns started to emerge from noise. It was like watching a photograph develop in chemicals, the image slowly clarifying from blank paper. He wrote a quick algorithm to search for similar anomalies, shifted decimal points, transposed digits, rounded numbers that should have been precise. The algorithm was elegant, efficient, born from years of hunting financial crimes through the solar system's shadow economy. The algorithm found 47 matches. David felt his pulse quicken. This was bigger than bad bookkeeping. Someone had been embedding errors into the financial records systematically, consistently, over the course of 2 years. But why? What was the pattern? He spent the next hour mapping the anomalies chronologically. No obvious sequence emerged. Then he mapped them by transaction type. Nothing. Then by amount. That's when he saw it. The amounts weren't random. When you extracted just the shifted digits and arranged them in sequence, they formed something. Not quite numbers. Not quite coordinates. But definitely intentional. David's hands were shaking now. This wasn't smuggler incompetence. This was a code. A message hidden in financial noise meant to be found by someone who knew how to look. Someone exactly like David Chen. The implications were staggering. Whoever had planted this code had access to multiple companies' financial systems. Had the sophistication to embed errors that would pass cursory review. Had the patience to maintain the pattern over 2 years. And they'd done it knowing that eventually, someone with David's specific skill set would find it. He should have stopped there. Should have closed the file, reported the irregularities to his client, collected his fee, and moved on. That's what a smart man would have done. That's what a man who'd already lost everything to curiosity would have done. But David Chen had never been good at leaving puzzles unsolved. The Mars night deepened outside his window. The dome's lights created an artificial constellation overhead, a poor substitute for Earth's sky but better than the red emptiness beyond. David barely noticed. His attention was consumed by the data, by the pattern emerging from chaos. He expanded his search, pulling financial records from adjacent operations. The smuggling ring had connections to import-export businesses, mining operations, even a few legitimate corporations. If this pattern existed in one set of books, maybe it existed in others. The search took time. David had to breach security protocols, navigate encryption, access databases that weren't meant to be accessed. He was good at this too, not as good as a dedicated hacker, but good enough. The coalition had taught him well, back when he was one of their golden boys. Back when he still believed the system could work. It took him 3 more hours to find the next thread. A shipping company based on Europa. Their financial records showed the same type of anomalies, shifted decimals, transposed digits, numbers that were just slightly wrong in ways that multiple accountants had somehow missed. David's algorithm pulled 63 matches from their database. His coffee had gone cold hours ago. His eyes burned from staring at displays. His back ached from hunching over his terminal. David ignored it all. The pattern was there. He could feel it, just beyond his grasp, waiting to be understood. When he combined the sequences from both companies, something emerged. A symbol first. 7 points arranged in a constellation that didn't match any star chart David knew. Rendered in ASCII characters, crude but unmistakable. And at its center, something his rendering software couldn't quite display properly. A geometric shape that made his eyes slide away whenever he tried to focus on it. The symbol appeared between every cluster of anomalies, like a signature or a marker. And when David mapped the symbol's recurring positions across all the data sets, treating each appearance as a waypoint, the 7 points themselves formed coordinates. A single location. David stared at the display, his analytical mind struggling to process what he was seeing. This was beyond sophisticated. This was art. Someone had embedded a symbol and coordinates into financial records across multiple companies, creating a map that could only be found by someone who understood both cryptography and forensic accounting. The elegance of it was terrifying. He pulled up more databases. Mining operations on Ceres. Construction firms on Titan. A medical supply distributor on Earth. The pattern repeated. Always different companies. Always different transaction types. But always the same symbol, always encoding the same coordinates, hidden in plain sight across dozens of corporate databases spanning the solar system. The coordinates pointed to a location in the belt, an unremarkable sector, according to public records. No registered stations, no mining claims, no reason for anyone to be there. But someone had spent 7 years. David could trace the anomalies back that far, embedding this symbol and its coordinates into financial records across the solar system. 7 years of systematic, meticulous data manipulation. And not just the coordinates. There was something else encoded in the pattern. Transaction amounts. When David isolated just the skimmed funds, the tiny fractions of percentage points being shaved off each transaction, and calculated the total, his blood ran cold. 4.3 trillion interstellar credits. ISKs. Someone had been stealing 4.3 trillion ISK over 7 years, in increments so small that no single company would notice. A fraction of a percent here, a rounding error there, decimal points shifted just enough to skim without triggering audits. And all of it pointing to that one location in the belt. David pulled up a deep space scan of the coordinates. Nothing. Empty space, as far as official records were concerned. But when he ran a spectral analysis, looking for heat signatures or electromagnetic emissions, he found something odd. A shadow. A dead zone where his scan simply stopped. As if something was there but was actively deflecting detection. The symbol haunted him. 7 points with something impossible at the center. Every time he looked at it, his eyes hurt. Every time he tried to focus on the geometric shape in the middle, his vision blurred and his head began to ache. It was as if the symbol existed in more dimensions than his screen could properly display, as if he was seeing a three-dimensional shadow of something that had more angles than geometry allowed. David sat back from his terminal, his mind racing. Someone had embedded coordinates into the financial records of multiple companies across different planets. Companies that on paper had no connection to each other. Someone had gone to extraordinary lengths to hide a message where only a very specific type of person would find it. An accountant. A forensic analyst. Someone who could see patterns in financial noise. Someone exactly like David Chen. But it wasn't just coordinates. It was a funding operation. 4.3 trillion ISK, skimmed over 7 years from companies spanning the entire solar system, all flowing to a location that didn't officially exist. What could you build with 4.3 trillion ISK in secret? What would require that kind of money, that kind of operational security, that level of coordination across multiple planetary jurisdictions? The rational part of his mind was screaming at him to stop. To delete his research, wipe his terminal, and forget he'd ever seen this. He'd been burned once before for asking the wrong questions. The coalition had made sure of that, leaked his personnel file, fabricated evidence of corruption, destroyed his reputation so thoroughly that the only work he could find was calculating profit margins for criminals on Mars. But the irrational part, the part that had made him a brilliant analyst in the first place, needed to know what this meant. Outside his window, Mars slept. Or pretended to. The dome lights had dimmed to simulate Earth's diurnal rhythm, though the planet itself knew no such cycle. In the false darkness, David could almost imagine he was home. Almost forget that home had rejected him, destroyed him, left him here on the frontier to rot. He pulled up the coordinates on a star chart, an unremarkable sector in the belt. Nothing that would draw attention. But someone had spent 7 years building toward something. And they'd left a trail that only someone with David's very specific skills could follow. Why? David saved his research to an encrypted drive, then to 2 more backup drives hidden in different formats. Whatever this was, he wasn't going to lose it. Then he made his first mistake. He sent a message to an old colleague from his coalition days. Dr. Sarah Venkatesan, a xenoarchaeologist who specialized in pre-human artifacts found in the outer system. If anyone could identify the symbol, it would be her. The message was encrypted, routed through anonymous servers, untraceable. Or so David thought. He attached the symbol and the coordinates, along with a brief explanation of how he'd found them. Sarah was one of the few people from his old life who'd believed him about Prometheus distribution, who hadn't turned her back when the coalition destroyed his reputation. She'd understand. She'd help. David sent the message and sat back, suddenly exhausted. The adrenaline that had carried him through the night was fading, leaving behind the crash. His body ached. His eyes burned. His mind felt sluggish, overwhelmed by the implications of what he'd discovered. 4.3 trillion ISK. 7 years. A location that didn't exist on any official map. And a symbol that hurt to look at, that suggested dimensions human minds weren't meant to perceive. David stood, stretched, felt his spine crack in 3 places. He needed sleep. Needed food. Needed to think about this with a clear head before deciding what to do next. The office felt different now. Smaller. More claustrophobic. As if by discovering the pattern, by pulling on this thread, he'd changed something fundamental about his relationship with the world. as if something vast and terrible had noticed him. David shook off the feeling. Paranoia. Exhaustion. The mind playing tricks in the small hours of the Martian night. He locked his terminal, secured his backup drives in a hidden safe behind a false panel in the wall, and prepared to leave. The walk back to his apartment would take 20 minutes through Olympus City's lower levels, through corridors that smelled of recycled air and desperation. He was reaching for his coat when his terminal chimed. Sarah's reply. Already. That was fast. The message lagged to Titan, should have been at least 40 minutes each way. David opened the message, his stomach already tightening with unease. The text was brief. David, where did you find this? This symbol. I've seen something like it before. Not exactly the same, but close. In ruins on Titan. We're not supposed to talk about them. And those coordinates you sent. There's nothing there according to any official database, but I ran some old deep space scans. There's definitely something there. Something massive. Something that's being actively hidden. Call me. Use the old secure channel. David's hands were shaking as he read the message. Ruins on Titan. Pre-human artifacts. Things they weren't supposed to talk about. The symbol wasn't just a financial code. It was something older. Something that predated human presence in the solar system. And he'd just sent it to someone who'd seen it before. David was about to initiate the secure call when his office door chimed. He froze. He wasn't expecting anyone. His clients never came to his office. Everything was handled remotely, deliberately anonymous. And it was the middle of the Martian night cycle. Nobody should be here. He glanced at the door's security feed. A woman stood in the hallway. And David Chen's world began to end for the second time. End of Part 1. Part 2, The Siren. The woman in the hallway was not what David expected. She was somewhere in her 40s, though the exact age was hard to pin down. Her face held that quality of timelessness that came from either excellent genetics or expensive treatments. Professional attire, a tailored suit in charcoal gray that followed the lines of her body with precision that bordered on indecent. The cut was conservative, technically appropriate for business, but something about the way the fabric moved suggested things that had nothing to do with commerce. Her hair was dark, pulled back in a style that was severe and elegant simultaneously. Her face was striking rather than beautiful, sharp cheekbones, full lips painted a dark red that looked almost black in the dim corridor lighting, eyes that were too knowing, too aware. But it was the way she stood that caught David's attention. The slight cock of her hip, the casual confidence of someone who knew exactly what effect she had on people. The faint smile playing at the corners of her mouth, as if she could read his thoughts and found them amusing. She looked like power wearing skin, like danger wrapped in silk, like every terrible decision a man could make distilled into female form. David felt something primal stir in his gut. Not just attraction, though that was there undeniable, a heat that spread through his body before his conscious mind could process it, but also fear. The same instinct that made prey animals freeze when predators approached. She was beautiful in the way a blade was beautiful. Sharp, purposeful, designed to cut. Mr. Chen? Her voice came through the intercom, and it matched everything else about her. Smooth, rich. The kind of voice that could convince you to do things you'd regret later. My name is Rebecca Torres. I'm with Meridian Consolidated. I'd like to discuss a business opportunity with you. Meridian Consolidated. David forced himself to move, to pull up a quick search on his terminal. Import-export, registered on Ganymede, financially solvent but unremarkable. Nothing that would require an in-person visit to a disgraced accountant on Mars. Nothing that would send a woman like this. I handle consultations remotely, David said through the intercom, keeping his voice steady with effort. You can send your proposal to my public contact address. Rebecca's smile widened slightly, and David felt his pulse quicken. It was a predatory expression, knowing and amused. As if she could see through the door, through his professional facade, straight into the part of him that wanted her to stay. I'm afraid this requires a more personal touch. She shifted her weight, the movement drawing attention to the curve of her hip, the length of her legs. Everything about her body language was calculated, deliberate. A performance designed to disarm. We have mutual interests, Mr. Chen, regarding certain patterns you've been investigating. The heat in David's gut turned to ice. I don't know what you're talking about, he said, but his voice betrayed him, cracking slightly on the last word. Of course you don't. Rebecca's expression didn't change, but something in her eyes sharpened. But perhaps you should look at your terminal. Specifically, the file you've been working on for the last 7 hours. David's eyes snapped to his display. The file was still open, his research on the financial anomalies, the coordinates, the symbol. And as he watched, text began appearing at the bottom of the document. Text he wasn't typing. "We've been watching you, Mr. Chen. You're very good at finding patterns. That's why you were selected." David's hands flew across the keyboard, trying to kill the connection, shut down the terminal, anything. But his commands were being overridden. The system wasn't responding to him anymore. More text appeared. "You can't disconnect. You can't erase this. You've already seen too much. But that's all right. That's what we wanted. Now you have a choice." "What choice?" David said aloud, his voice tight with controlled panic. His analytical mind was racing through scenarios, trying to understand how they'd breached his security, how long they'd been watching, what they wanted. But another part of his mind, the hindbrain, the animal part that dealt in survival and reproduction, was still focused on the woman outside his door, on the curve of her throat where it disappeared into her collar, on the way her lips formed words, on the heat that her presence generated despite the fear. It was maddening, terrifying. He should be focusing on the threat, on the security breach, on the fact that he was compromised and in danger. Instead, part of him was imagining what her skin would feel like, what she would taste like, what sounds she would make. David Chen had been alone on Mars for 3 years. 3 years of exile, of loneliness, of nights spent with only his work for company. And now this woman, this dangerous, predatory, impossible woman, was offering him something he hadn't realized he'd been starving for. Attention, connection, the illusion of intimacy. He hated himself for wanting it. "The choice is simple," Rebecca said through the intercom, her voice dropping lower, more intimate. "You can open the door and discuss this like a civilized professional. Or you can try to run, and we'll have a much less pleasant conversation later." Her eyes found the camera, looking directly at him through the security feed. There was something in that gaze, an invitation and a threat, wound together so tightly they were inseparable. "Come to me. Submit to me. Let me devour you." David's hand moved toward the door release before his conscious mind made the decision. He stopped himself, forced his breathing to slow, thought through the situation with the analytical clarity that had made him the coalition's best forensic accountant. She'd hacked his terminal. She knew what he'd discovered. She represented people powerful enough to breach his security remotely and find him in the middle of the Martian night. She was offering him a choice between cooperation and consequences. None of this suggested opening the door was a good idea. But David Chen hadn't survived the coalition's purge by being reckless. He carefully saved his research to every backup location he could think of, encrypted with algorithms he'd designed himself. If they wanted to silence him, at least the data would survive. Small comfort, but comfort nonetheless. Then he opened the door. Rebecca Torres stepped into his office with the confidence of someone who knew they held all the advantages. Up close, she was even more overwhelming. The scent of her perfume hit him, something subtle and expensive, with notes of jasmine and something darker, muskier. A scent designed to bypass rational thought and speak directly to hindbrain instinct. It worked. "Thank you for being reasonable," she said, and her voice in person was even more affecting than through the intercom. Warm. Rich. The kind of voice that made promises in the dark. "May I sit? Do I have a choice?" "Not really." Her smile widened, and there was genuine amusement in it. "But I appreciate the courtesy nonetheless." She sat in the chair across from his desk, crossing her legs with a fluid grace that drew his eye despite his best efforts. The movement was natural, unconscious, or made to appear that way. Everything about her seemed calibrated to maximum effect. David remained standing, his back to the wall, calculating distances and angles. Not that it would help if this went physical. But old habits died hard. "You've stumbled onto something interesting, Mr. Chen," Rebecca said, her eyes tracking his movement with predatory attention. "Something that wasn't meant to be found yet. Not by you, at least." "Yet." David's mind caught on the word, analyzing its implications. Timing is important in any complex operation. You were supposed to find the pattern eventually. We made sure of that, placed the breadcrumbs carefully, adjusted the financial records to ping the particular frequencies of your analytical mind. She leaned forward slightly, the movement causing her suit jacket to fall open, just enough to reveal the curve of her throat, the shadow between her breasts. "But you found it too quickly. 16 days ahead of schedule." David felt sick, and aroused, and terrified. The combination was nauseating. "You wanted me to find it," he said, forcing himself to focus on her face, on her words, not on the way her body moved. You planted those anomalies deliberately. Not just wanted, needed. Rebecca's expression turned serious, though that undercurrent of amusement never quite left her eyes. You have a very specific skill set, Mr. Chen. Pattern recognition, financial analysis, and most importantly, she paused, studying him with an intensity that felt like physical touch. A certain flexibility in your moral reasoning. You've worked for criminals. You know how to look the other way when necessary. That makes you useful. Useful for what? Rebecca opened her briefcase with deliberate slowness, each movement precise and controlled. Inside were three things: a data chip, a gun, and a photograph. She slid the photograph across the desk with one perfectly manicured finger. The nail polish was the same dark red as her lips. It showed a man David had never seen before. Older, weathered, with the build of someone who'd spent time in hard labor. But his eyes were sharp, intelligent. Written on the back of the photograph was a name, Victor Kane. This man, Rebecca said, and her voice took on a different quality. Harder, more businesslike, though no less compelling, has been causing problems for certain interested parties. He runs smuggling operations across 3 planets. Very successful, very careful, but recently, he's been investigating things he shouldn't. Asking questions about financial irregularities in corporate databases. Questions very similar to the ones you've been asking. David's mind was racing, trying to understand the connection. You want me to find him? No. Rebecca's smile returned, and it was colder now. We know exactly where he is. We want you to understand that you're not alone in this. That there are others like you, people with specific abilities, specific tendencies, who are being moved into position for something larger. Moved by whom? Rebecca leaned back in her chair, a movement that should have been relaxing, but somehow emphasized the predatory grace of her posture. By people who understand patterns far more complex than financial spreadsheets, Mr. Chen. People who've been arranging events for a very long time. People who see the shape of things you can't even imagine. She picked up the data chip, holding it between 2 fingers, letting the light catch its crystalline surface. This contains a contract. Very well-paying work for someone with your talents. Legitimate work, or at least legitimately complex. Corporate audits for a network of companies that need discretion. You'll accept it, of course. You need the money, and the work will take you to interesting places. And if I refuse? Rebecca's expression didn't change, but something flickered in her eyes. Something that made David's mouth go dry. Then you'll spend the next 3 weeks trying to make sense of the patterns you've found. You'll dig deeper, looking for answers. You'll contact more colleagues, make more inquiries. And eventually, you'll attract the attention of people far less pleasant than me. She stood, the movement fluid and purposeful, and walked around the desk. Too close. Close enough that David could feel the heat radiating from her body, smell that perfume again, see the texture of her skin. People who don't believe in choices, Mr. Chen. People who believe in making problems disappear permanently. David's breath had gone shallow. She was invading his space deliberately, using her physicality as a weapon. And it was working. Part of him wanted to step back, to maintain distance, to preserve professional boundaries. Another part wanted to close the remaining inches between them. Wanted to find out if her skin was as soft as it looked. Wanted to taste that dark red lipstick. Wanted to surrender to whatever she was offering, consequences be damned. 3 years of loneliness. 3 years of exile. 3 years of telling himself he didn't need human connection, that work was enough, that survival was sufficient. All of it crumbling under the weight of her attention. So my choices are work for you or die. David managed to say, though his voice came out rougher than intended. Rebecca reached out, and David froze. Her finger traced along his jawline, barely touching, the contact electric. Her skin was warm, impossibly soft. The touch lasted only a second, but David felt it in his entire body. Your choices are work for people who might have answers to your questions, or die wondering what it all meant. Her voice had dropped to almost a whisper, intimate, as if they were the only 2 people in the universe. And between you and me, Mr. Chen, I think you'd much rather live. I think you'd rather know. I think you'd rather be part of something that matters, even if you don't understand it yet. Her hand dropped away, and David felt the loss of contact like a physical ache. She returned to her chair, leaving the data chip, the gun, and the photograph on his desk. The spell, if that's what it was, broke slightly. David could breathe again. Could think again. But his skin still burned where she'd touched him. The contract is legitimate, Rebecca said, back to her businesslike tone, though her eyes still held that knowing amusement. The pay is real, and the work will lead you exactly where you need to go. Whether you understand that now or later is irrelevant. She walked to the door, then paused. When she looked back at him, her expression had softened slightly. Not kindness. Rebecca Torres didn't seem capable of kindness, but something else. Understanding, perhaps. Or pity. Oh, and Mr. Chen? That symbol you found. The 7 points. It would be in your best interest not to discuss it with Dr. Venkatesan or anyone else. She checked something on her wrist display, casual, as if commenting on the weather. Her facility on Titan had an unfortunate accident this morning. Gas leak. Very tragic. These things happen in deep space operations. The words took a moment to penetrate. When they did, David felt the floor drop out from under him. You killed her. I didn't do anything. Rebecca's voice was calm, matter-of-fact. But people who ask too many questions about certain subjects have a statistically higher likelihood of experiencing unfortunate accidents. Remember that. She opened the door, and the corridor light spilled in, harsh and artificial after the soft glow of his office. One more thing, she said, turning back. You're wondering if what you're feeling right now is real. The attraction, the desire, the pull. Her smile was knowing, ancient. It is real. I am that beautiful. I am that dangerous. And you do want me, despite everything your rational mind is screaming. She let that hang in the air for a moment. That's not manipulation, Mr. Chen. That's just biology. Prey is always attracted to predators. Something about the thrill of death. The illusion that you might be the exception, the one who tames the monster. Her eyes held his, and David couldn't look away. You're not the exception, but you're welcome to imagine you are, if it makes this easier. Then she was gone, the door hissing shut behind her, leaving only the faint scent of her perfume and the weight of impossible choices. David stood frozen in his office for a long moment, his mind struggling to process what had just happened. Sarah was dead. Killed because he'd sent her a message about the symbol. Killed because she'd known something about ruins on Titan. His hands were shaking. His entire body was shaking. The fear was winning now, pushing past the arousal, past the confusion, settling into cold certainty. He was compromised. Watched. Trapped in something he didn't understand. And he'd wanted her. God help him. Even knowing what she was, what she represented, part of him had wanted Rebecca Torres with an intensity that frightened him. David looked at the items on his desk. The contract. The gun. The photograph of Victor Kane. He should run. Should take his backup drives and disappear into the belt colonies where no one could find him. He had contacts, resources, enough money to vanish if he was careful. But David knew it wouldn't matter. Rebecca had said they'd been watching him. They'd hacked his terminal remotely, overridden his security, planted anomalies in financial records across multiple companies just to see if he'd find them. These weren't people you ran from. These were people who'd been planning this for months, maybe years. And Sarah was dead because of him. David picked up the data chip with shaking hands. The contract Rebecca mentioned. Work that would lead him exactly where he needed to go. He plugged it into his terminal, hating himself, hating her, hating the universe that had brought him to this moment. The contract was exactly as she'd described. Corporate audits for a network of companies, all subsidiaries of Meridian Consolidated. The pay was absurd, 10 times what he usually made. The work would require travel, 3 weeks on Europa, 2 weeks on Ganymede, a week in the belt. And attached to the contract, almost as an afterthought, was a list of financial databases he'd need to access. David recognized several of them immediately. These were the same companies where he'd found the original anomalies. The same companies whose records contained the hidden coordinates and the symbol. They were giving him permission to investigate. No, not permission. They were directing him to investigate, guiding him down a path they'd already chosen. David should have deleted it all. Should have wiped his drives and walked away. Instead, he found himself reading the contract terms. Found himself analyzing the scope of work. Found himself already planning how he'd approach the audits, which databases to investigate first, what patterns to look for. Not because he wanted to work for people who'd killed Sarah. Not because he believed their promises of answers. But because the alternative was dying without understanding what any of this meant. And David Chen had never been good at accepting mysteries. He looked at the photograph of Victor Kane again. Another person being moved into position. Another piece in a pattern he couldn't see. And the symbol, still displayed on his terminal. 7 points arranged like stars that didn't exist. Something at the center that his eyes couldn't quite focus on. Something that suggested dimensions his mind wasn't equipped to perceive. David had a feeling he'd be seeing that symbol again, whether he wanted to or not. Outside his window, false dawn was beginning to paint the Martian sky in shades of pink and orange. Another day in Olympus City. Another day of survival in exile. But everything had changed. The comfortable routine of his exile, the safe mediocrity of calculating profit margins for criminals, all of it had been stripped away, revealed as an illusion. He'd always been watched, always been guided. The breadcrumbs had been laid for him specifically, waiting for his particular brand of brilliance to find them. And now he was caught in something vast and terrible, and the only way forward was deeper into the trap. David's terminal chimed. A news alert from Titan. Dr. Sarah Venkatesan confirmed dead in an industrial accident at a research facility. No survivors. Investigation pending. The official story was already in place. Clean. Efficient. As if Sarah's life could be reduced to a bureaucratic footnote. David closed the alert and stared at the data chip sitting on his desk. He thought about Rebecca Torres, about the way she'd touched his face, about the heat he'd felt when she was close, about the terrible attraction that still pulsed in his veins despite everything. She'd been right. It was biology. Prey attracted to predators. The lizard brain seeing danger and mistaking it for excitement. But knowing that didn't make it stop. David Chen had lost everything 3 years ago when he'd tried to expose Prometheus distribution. Had been destroyed, exiled, reduced to this half-life on Mars. Now he was being given a choice, lose everything again, or become complicit in something he didn't understand. Work for people who killed with casual efficiency. Follow a path laid by hands he couldn't see toward a destination he couldn't imagine. Some choice. He ejected the data chip, held it in his palm. So small. So innocuous. Just crystalline storage medium and quantum encryption. And yet it represented his future. Whatever future he had left. David looked at the gun Rebecca had left. He picked it up, felt its weight. A Hell-Ion, 6-pulse pistol, compact and deadly. Standard corporate security issue. Was it a gift? A threat? A test? Probably all three. He secured the gun in his desk drawer, pocketed the data chip, and stood. His body ached from the long night. His mind felt sluggish, overwhelmed by revelation and fear and the lingering heat of Rebecca Torres's presence. He needed sleep. Needed to think clearly before making any decisions. But as he prepared to leave his office, David knew the decision was already made. Had been made the moment he opened the door. The moment Rebecca Torres walked into his life with her dark red lips and her promises, and her casual mention of Sarah's death. He was theirs now. Had been selected, groomed, manipulated into position. And the only way forward was to see where the pattern led. Even if it led to his own destruction. David locked his office and walked into the Martian dawn, carrying the weight of 4.3 trillion ISK, and a symbol that hurt to perceive, and the memory of a woman who'd touched his face while discussing murder. The game was in motion. The pieces were moving. And David Chen was no longer sure if he was a player, or just another piece on a board he couldn't see. End Part 2. Part 3, The Trap. David didn't go home immediately. His body still hummed with adrenaline and something darker. Arousal wound tight with fear, the chemical cocktail Rebecca Torres had deliberately mixed in his system. Her touch still burned on his jaw. Her scent still lingered in his nostrils. The promises in her voice still echoed in the hollow spaces of his mind. He needed a drink. Needed to wash away the memory of her proximity, the terrible knowledge of Sarah's death, the weight of choices that weren't really choices at all. David left his office building and descended into Olympus City's lower levels, where the bars stayed open through all cycles and nobody asked questions. The kind of places where coalition exiles and corporate washouts drown their failures in synthetic alcohol and chemical comfort. 3 blocks from his office, he felt it, the prickling sensation at the base of his skull. The animal awareness that something was watching. Hunting. David didn't turn around. Didn't change his pace. Just adjusted his route slightly, taking a left turn that kept him in a corridor with active foot traffic. Night shift workers heading to the atmospheric processors, service personnel moving between districts. The watcher followed. David could feel them back there. Not close enough to be obvious, but persistent. Matching his pace. Maintaining distance. Professional surveillance or amateur stalking, he couldn't tell yet. His mind cycled through possibilities. Rebecca's people, making sure he didn't run. Coalition operatives who'd finally decided exile wasn't enough punishment? Someone from one of his criminal clients, concerned about the audit he was conducting? Or something worse, whatever organization had orchestrated Sarah's death, ensuring their newest piece stayed on the board? David took another turn, this time toward a busier commercial district. More lights, more cameras, more witnesses. If his shadow wanted him dead, they'd have to do it publicly. The presence followed, closer now. David could almost feel their proximity, like heat radiating from behind him. His heart hammered against his ribs. Sweat beaded on his forehead despite the climate-controlled air. Every survival instinct screamed at him to run, to find security, to get somewhere safe. But there was nowhere safe. Not anymore. Rebecca had made that clear. David ducked into a bar called The Rust, a dive establishment that catered to the bottom tier of Martian colonial life. The interior was dim, smoky with vaporized narcotics, and smelled of spilled alcohol and desperation. Perfect. He ordered whiskey. Real Earth whiskey, not the synthetic Martian substitutes. It cost 3 times as much, but tonight he needed authenticity, needed something that tasted like it came from somewhere real, somewhere that still existed outside this nightmare. The bartender, a woman with chrome implants replacing most of her left arm, poured without comment and moved away. David drank. The burn helped. Gave him something physical to focus on besides the memory of Rebecca's finger on his skin, besides the knowledge that Sarah was dead, besides the watcher who'd followed him here, and was probably even now positioning themselves somewhere in the bar's shadows. You look like you've had a rough day. The voice was female, smoky, carefully modulated to sound sultry without trying too hard. David looked up. The woman standing beside him was professional. Not corporate professional, but sex work professional. Late 20s, maybe early 30s. Enhanced features, fuller lips, larger eyes, bone structure subtly adjusted to maximize conventional attractiveness. Her hair was dark and fell in waves around her shoulders. Her dress was red, tight, designed to advertise availability. And there was something about her face. The shape of her cheekbones. The curve of her lips. A resemblance that made David's pulse quicken before his conscious mind could process why. She looked like Rebecca Torres. Not identical. The enhancements weren't that precise, and Rebecca's predatory elegance was unique, but similar enough that David's body responded with a Pavlovian jolt of arousal and fear. "I'm not interested," David said, his voice carefully neutral. She smiled, knowing. "You say that, but your body language tells me otherwise." A honey pot, asterisk David thought. Asterisk they sent her to trap me, to compromise me further, to get leverage. He'd dealt with this before, in his coalition days. Sex workers recruited by intelligence services, by corporate security, by criminal organizations. Trained to seduce targets, extract information, create blackmail material. "I said I'm not interested," David repeated, taking another drink. The woman slid onto the stool beside him, uninvited but not aggressive. "Fair enough. Can I at least sit here? The other men in this bar are." She gestured vaguely at the room. Less appealing company. David studied her. Looked for signs of deception, of hostile intent. Found only practiced professionalism and, perhaps, genuine weariness. Maybe she was exactly what she appeared to be. A working girl looking for a client who didn't look like he'd hurt her. No conspiracy. No trap. Just commerce in the oldest human economy. Or maybe that's what they wanted him to think. "Suit yourself," David said. They sat in silence for a moment. The woman ordered her own drink, something colorful and expensive, automatically charged to David's tab. He didn't protest. If she was surveillance, offending her would just make things worse. If she wasn't, well, he could afford one overpriced cocktail. "I'm Lydia," she offered. "David." "What brings you to the Rust, David? This isn't exactly corporate territory." "Maybe I'm not corporate anymore." She laughed softly. "No, you're definitely not. You've got that exile look. Like you used to be something and now you're just surviving." The accuracy stung. What gave it away? The expensive watch. The quality clothes. The way you carry yourself, like you're used to respect but don't expect it anymore. She sipped her drink. "I've seen a lot of exiles. They all have the same haunted look, like they're waiting for the other shoe to drop." David felt something shift inside him. Not trust, he couldn't afford trust. But recognition. This woman, whoever she was, understood loss. Understood what it meant to fall from somewhere higher. "What about you?" he asked. "How does someone end up working the Rust?" The usual story. Bad choices, worse luck, and a system that doesn't forgive mistakes. She met his eyes. We're not so different, you and I. We both do what we have to in order to survive. David finished his whiskey, signaled for another. The alcohol was helping, dulling the edges, making the constant fear slightly more manageable. I should be going, he said, though he made no move to leave. You could, Lydia agreed. Or you could come with me. Let me help you forget about whatever's eating you. Just for a few hours. Asterisk trap. Definitely a trap, asterisk. But David's body was responding. The alcohol, the stress, Rebecca's deliberate seduction earlier, it all coalesced into a need that was becoming harder to ignore. 3 years of celibacy. 3 years of isolation. His body was screaming for touch, for connection, for the temporary oblivion of physical pleasure. How much? He heard himself ask. For the whole night? 200 ISK. Expensive, but not unreasonably so. David ran the calculations automatically. He could afford it, especially with Rebecca's contract payment incoming. And if this was a trap, they'd spring it whether he slept with her or not. At least this way he'd get something out of his final hours before everything went to hell. Not a hotel, David said. My place. Lydia smiled. Worried about surveillance? Always. Smart man. Your place works fine. David paid his tab, left a generous tip for the chrome-armed bartender, and stood. The room tilted slightly. He'd drunk more than he'd realized. Not enough to be impaired, but enough that his edges were softened, his paranoia slightly muted. Lydia took his arm, playing the role of companion rather than hired professional. To any observer, they were just another couple leaving a bar together. As they stepped into the corridor, David scanned for his shadow. Saw nothing obvious. Maybe they'd gone. Maybe they'd accomplished whatever surveillance objective they'd had. Or maybe they were just better at hiding now. David led Lydia toward his apartment building, taking a different route than usual, longer, more circuitous, designed to shake any followers. His arousal was building with each step, fueled by alcohol and stress, and the way Lydia's body pressed against his side. The presence was still there. David could feel it, that crawling sensation between his shoulder blades. Eyes watching from somewhere in the shadows. But as his need intensified, as the whiskey and Rebecca's manipulation and 3 years of loneliness converged, he pushed the awareness down. Ignored it. He'd forgotten about the watcher. Or rather, he'd stopped caring. Forgotten about everything except the promise of a few hours where nothing mattered except physical sensation and temporary escape. Behind them, unseen, a figure merged with the shadows. Watching. Recording. Evaluating. David's apartment was small and impersonal, just furniture and terminal equipment, nothing that suggested anyone actually lived there. Lydia looked around with the practiced eye of someone who'd seen hundreds of such spaces. You weren't kidding about the exile thing, she said. This place has all the warmth of a storage locker. I don't spend much time here, David said, already moving toward the bedroom. Lydia followed. In the bedroom, she began the practiced routine of her profession, removing her dress with calculated grace, revealing a body that had been enhanced for maximum appeal. Curves in all the right places. Skin that seemed to glow in the dim light. David's arousal spiked. His hands moved to his own clothes, fumbling with buttons, his coordination impaired by alcohol and desperate need. Slow down, Lydia said, her voice taking on a different quality, still professional but softer, more intimate. We have time. But David didn't feel like he had time. Felt like this might be his last night before Rebecca's trap closed completely, before whatever waited in the belt consumed him. Last chance to feel something human, something real, something that wasn't manipulation and fear. He reached for Lydia, pulled her close, kissed her with more aggression than finesse. She responded with professional skill, matching his intensity, guiding his hands to her body, making small sounds of encouragement that might have been genuine pleasure or might have been performance. It didn't matter. David was past caring about authenticity. They fell onto the bed together. David's hands explored her body, the modified curves, the enhanced sensitivity points that her profession had required her to install. Every touch drew practiced responses, her body arching, her breath catching, her fingers digging into his shoulders. He entered her without ceremony, without the tender preliminaries that love required. This wasn't love. Wasn't even genuine desire. This was need, raw, desperate, the biological imperative overriding every rational thought. Lydia's legs wrapped around his waist, pulling him deeper. Her nails traced lines down his back, not quite breaking skin, but close. The pain mingled with pleasure, sharpening his focus, grounding him in physical sensation. David thrust harder, faster, chasing release like a drowning man gasping for air. His mind was fracturing. Images of Rebecca's dark red lips, of Sarah's smile in old photographs, of Lydia's enhanced body writhing beneath him, all bleeding together into a confused wash of guilt and arousal and grief. "That's it," Lydia whispered in his ear, her voice taking on an edge that reminded him of Rebecca's controlled dominance. "Let it all out. Stop thinking. Just feel." The words triggered something. David's rhythm became erratic, desperate. He was close, teetering on the edge, his entire being focused on that singular point of release. When it came, it was violent. A climax that felt less like pleasure and more like exorcism, his body purging days of stress and fear and accumulated arousal into her modified flesh. He collapsed onto Lydia, gasping, his muscles trembling with aftershocks. For a few seconds, his mind was blessedly empty. No Rebecca, no Sarah, no conspiracy, just the biological aftermath of orgasm, the chemical cocktail of endorphins and oxytocin that made everything seem briefly manageable. Then reality crashed back. David rolled off Lydia, suddenly aware of what he'd done. He'd just paid a prostitute to fuck away his guilt over Sarah's death, his fear of Rebecca's manipulation, his complicity in a conspiracy he didn't understand. Lydia seemed to sense his mood shift. She sat up, reaching for her clothes with practiced efficiency. No cuddling. No intimacy. Transaction complete. "You okay?" she asked, her professional mask back in place. "Fine," David lied. "You sure? Because you look like a man who just realized something." "I'm sure." Lydia finished dressing, collected her payment from the terminal he'd activated with a distracted gesture. 200 ISK transferred. Commerce completed. "For what it's worth," she said at the door, "whatever you're running from, it'll still be there tomorrow. But at least you got a few hours of not thinking about it." Then she was gone, the door closing behind her with a soft click. David lay in his bed, staring at the ceiling, his body spent but his mind racing. He'd sought comfort in a woman who looked like Rebecca Torres, had used her enhanced body as a surrogate for the predator who'd invaded his office, who'd casually mentioned Sarah's murder, who'd manipulated him with surgical precision. And even now, lying in the aftermath, part of him was still thinking about Rebecca, about the way she'd looked at him, about her promise of more visits, about the way his body had responded to her despite knowing what she was. They'd gotten inside his head, deeper than he'd realized. David forced himself up, stumbled to the bathroom, tried to wash away the evidence of his weakness. But the water couldn't touch what bothered him most, the knowledge that he'd sought physical comfort while Sarah lay dead because of his investigation, that his body had found release even as his soul was being systematically destroyed, and that somewhere out there, the presence that had followed him was still watching, still waiting, still evaluating him for purposes he couldn't understand. David was still restless, his body too wired despite the physical release, his thoughts bouncing around like 1,000 racquetballs in a confined space. The sensation of being watched hadn't left. If anything, it had intensified. He couldn't stay in this stale room, couldn't lie here with that crawling awareness between his shoulder blades. David saw himself stand, saw himself pull on clothes with mechanical efficiency, saw himself walk out the door as if watching from outside his own body. The corridors were quieter now, the night cycled deep enough that most of the city slept. David walked through Olympus City's lower levels, through sections where the desperate and the exiled made their lives. Past workers heading to early shifts in the atmospheric processors. Past bars closing after the night cycle, their patrons stumbling into the artificial dawn. Past the homeless sleeping in maintenance alcoves, wrapped in thermal blankets, forgotten by a system that had no use for them. He walked and tried not to think about Sarah, tried not to remember her laugh, the way she defended him when the coalition leaked those fabricated corruption charges, the messages she'd sent during his first months on Mars, checking in, making sure he was surviving, refusing to believe the lies they'd told about him. She'd been one of the few, one of the handful of people who'd known him well enough to see through the manufactured evidence, who'd believed in his integrity even when every official channel said otherwise. And he'd gotten her killed. The weight of that sat in his chest like a stone. Cold, heavy, inescapable. The presence was still there, following. David felt it in the empty corridors, in the spaces between streetlights, in the reflections on polished surfaces. Never visible, never obvious. Just that constant awareness of being observed. He didn't try to lose it anymore. Didn't bother with evasive routes. Whatever was watching him had already seen everything. There was no privacy left. No escape. David found himself in Observation Plaza, a large dome section with reinforced viewing ports that looked out over the Martian landscape. During peak hours, it would be crowded with tourists and colonists taking in the view. At this hour, it was nearly empty. He stood at the viewing port and stared out at the rust-colored wasteland beyond the dome. The sun was rising, painting the landscape in shades of red and orange and pink. Beautiful in its desolate way. Alien. Hostile to human life. Mars had been terraformed for a century now, but it was still fundamentally inhospitable. The atmosphere was still too thin. The temperature still too cold. The radiation still too intense. Humanity existed here only through constant technological intervention, through domes and processors and systems that required endless maintenance. One failure, one cascade, one moment of systemic breakdown, and everyone would die. David had always found that oddly comforting. The honesty of it. On Mars, you couldn't pretend civilization was permanent. Couldn't ignore the fact that survival was provisional, temporary, dependent on systems that could fail at any moment. Earth had the same problems, of course. But Earth had enough redundancy, enough infrastructure, enough inertia that people could pretend otherwise. Could believe in permanence. Could imagine that the systems would always work, that civilization would always protect them. Mars didn't allow such illusions. David's reflection stared back at him from the viewing port, superimposed over the Martian dawn. He looked tired, older than his 41 years. The exile had aged him, worn him down in ways that had nothing to do with physical deterioration. He'd been brilliant once. The Coalition's golden boy. The analyst who could trace money through any maze of shell corporations and encryption. The man they sent when they needed answers nobody else could find. Now he was just another exile, calculating profit margins for criminals, living in a rented apartment in Olympus City's cheaper districts, slowly running out of reasons to care about his own survival. And then Rebecca Torres had walked into his office and changed everything. David's body still remembered her presence. The scent of her perfume, the touch of her finger on his jaw, the heat that had flooded through him when she stood too close, invading his space with deliberate precision. He hated that he'd responded. Hated that even knowing what she was, a predator, a manipulator, someone who'd casually mentioned Sarah's murder, he'd wanted her. Still wanted her, if he was honest with himself. 3 years of loneliness. 3 years of survival without connection. The human animal was weak, desperate for touch, for attention, for the illusion of intimacy. Rebecca had weaponized that weakness, had used his own biology against him. And it had worked. David pressed his forehead against the cool polymer of the viewing port. The city was waking up around him. More workers flowing through corridors. More shifts beginning. The endless cycle of labor and survival that kept Olympus City functioning. He could walk away. Could take his backup drives and disappear into the belt. Could become just another anonymous face in the asteroid colonies where law was negotiable and identity was fluid. But Rebecca's words echoed in his mind. Then you'll spend the next 3 weeks trying to make sense of the patterns you've found. You'll dig deeper looking for answers. You'll contact more colleagues, make more inquiries. And eventually, you'll attract the attention of people far less pleasant than me. They'd been watching him. Had been for how long? Months? Years? Since he'd arrived on Mars, or even before that. The breadcrumbs had been laid specifically for him. The financial anomalies embedded in records across the solar system, waiting for someone with his exact skill set to find them. He'd been selected, groomed, manipulated, and Sarah had died because he'd pulled on the thread they'd deliberately left hanging. David's hands clenched into fists. Anger was starting to burn through the shock and fear. They'd used him, had orchestrated this entire situation, had made him complicit in Sarah's death through sheer manipulation. But anger wasn't useful. Anger was what got people killed when they went up against power like this. David had learned that 3 years ago, when he'd tried to expose Prometheus distribution, when he'd believed that evidence and truth would matter, that the system would work if you followed its rules. The system had destroyed him for that belief. So what was different now? Why should he believe that following their path would lead anywhere except to his own destruction? The answer was simple, terrible. He didn't believe it would lead anywhere good. But at least this way, he'd understand why he was being destroyed. At least he'd know what the pattern meant, what the symbol represented, what 4.3 trillion ISK was funding in a hidden location in the belt. At least he'd die knowing. Some comfort. David pushed away from the viewing port and headed back toward his apartment. He needed sleep. Needed to approach this with a clear head. Needed to decide whether to accept Rebecca's contract or try to disappear. Though the decision was already made, really. Had been made the moment she walked through his door. The presence followed him home. Silent. Patient. Inevitable. David collapsed onto his bed without undressing. Exhaustion crashed over him like a wave. His body was demanding rest, shutting down non-essential functions, preparing for sleep. But his mind kept spinning, analyzing, trying to understand the pattern. 7 points. 7 years of skimming. 7 companies in his initial search, though there were certainly more. 7 something. The number felt significant, though he couldn't articulate why. And the symbol. That impossible shape at the center of the 7 points. Every time he tried to remember it clearly, his mind slid away, unable to hold the geometry in conscious thought. What was it? What did it represent? And who was watching him? The presence that had followed him since Rebecca left hadn't revealed itself. Hadn't made contact. Hadn't threatened or warned. Just watched. Observed. Waited. Were they connected to Rebecca? To the conspiracy? Or were they something else entirely? Too many unknowns. Too many questions. David's eyes closed. Sleep pulled at him, inexorable. His last conscious thought was of Rebecca Torres, of her dark red lips forming words that promised everything and nothing. Then the dream took him. David stood in darkness. Not the comfortable darkness of a room with lights off. Not even the void of deep space. This was something else. An absence so complete it felt like pressure against his skin, against his eyes, against his mind. He couldn't see his own body. Couldn't feel the ground beneath his feet, if there was ground. Couldn't hear his own breathing. But he knew he wasn't alone. Something watched him from that darkness. Multiple somethings. Presences that existed just beyond perception, like shapes seen in peripheral vision, that disappeared when you looked directly at them. Then the symbol appeared. It materialized in the void, 7 points of light arranged in that constellation he'd seen in the financial records. But now it was larger. More complex. The points weren't static. They pulsed, shifted, moved in patterns that suggested depth, dimension, spaces that shouldn't exist. And at the center, that geometric impossibility. The shape his eyes couldn't focus on, that made his brain hurt when he tried to understand its angles. David tried to look away. Couldn't. His body, if he still had a body, wouldn't respond to his commands. The symbol rotated slowly, revealing new facets, new angles. Each rotation showed him something different, something wrong, something that violated every rule of geometry he'd learned. It was beautiful and terrible. A door and a lock. A question and an answer. Everything and nothing. David's mind reached toward it, trying to understand, trying to decode its meaning. That's when the pain started. Not physical pain, though his body would ache later, muscles tensed against phantom agony. This was deeper. His consciousness being pulled toward the symbol like a moth to flame. His thoughts fragmenting, dissolving, unable to hold their shape in proximity to that impossible geometry. He tried to pull back, tried to resist. But the harder he fought, the worse it became. The symbol expanded, filling his vision, filling his mind, filling everything. And then the darkness shattered into images. Rebecca Torres above him, straddling him, her dark hair falling like a curtain around their faces. Her hands pinning his wrists above his head with impossible strength. Her lips against his throat, his chest lower. Her teeth breaking skin. The pain and pleasure indistinguishable, overwhelming. The image dissolved back into the symbol's rotating geometry, but the sensation remained. Arousal and terror wound so tightly together they were inseparable. Another flash. Rebecca's nails digging into his shoulders, drawing blood. Her voice in his ear, commanding, cruel. "You're mine now. Say it." And David heard himself respond, broken, pleading, surrendering everything. Back to the symbol. The 7 points pulsing in rhythm with a heartbeat that might have been his, might have been something far older and more terrible. Another image. His body marked with her attention, scratches, bites, bruises that formed patterns on his skin. Patterns that matched the symbol. 7 points across his torso converging toward his center. Rebecca's fingers tracing them, her touch burning, her smile triumphant and predatory. "Good," she whispered in the dream vision. "You're ready now. You're prepared." The symbol again, but now it was inside him. He could feel it in his chest, in his bones, in the coating of his DNA. The impossible geometry, rewriting him from the inside out. More flashes. Faster now. Rebecca's body against his in positions of control and dominance. His complete surrender. His desperate need. her satisfaction at his breaking. Each intimate moment intercut with glimpses of the symbol, until the two became indistinguishable. Sex and cosmic horror, pleasure and violation, his body's response and his mind's dissolution. And through it all, those impressions. Not words, not even thoughts. Just fragments bleeding through the dream. Asterisk selection. Purpose. Arrangement. 7. Pattern. Keys. Door. Ready. Marked. Claimed. Complete. Asterisk. The impressions were clinical. Detached. Whatever was watching him didn't care about his suffering. Didn't care about his fear or his arousal, or the way his body was responding to these visions of Rebecca. He was data, a variable in an equation too large for him to perceive. One final image, Rebecca sitting across from him in his office, fully clothed, professional, but her eyes knowing everything. Seeing his dreams. Understanding his desire. Owning him completely. "You're mine," she said again. "You've always been mine. From the moment I walked through your door. From the moment your body responded. From the moment you couldn't resist." The symbol pulsed. Once. Twice. 7 times. And with each pulse, David felt something change inside him. Not physical. Not even really psychological. Something deeper. Something at the level of pattern and purpose. He was being marked. Claimed. Incorporated into something larger than himself. And his body was responding with shameful, terrible pleasure. Then mercifully the dream released him. David woke in stages, his body fighting its way back to consciousness like a drowning man breaking the surface. The first thing he noticed was the wetness. His sheets were soaked, sweat, he thought at first. But no, not just sweat. Horror crashed over him as he realized what had happened. His body had responded to the dream, to those terrible, violating images of Rebecca dominating him, of cosmic horror intertwined with sexual submission, with arousal, with release. As if his unconscious mind had been programmed to conflate violation with pleasure, as if they'd reached into his sleeping brain and rewired his most primal responses. He'd ejaculated in his sleep, like a teenager, like an animal, his body betraying him even as his mind had been drowning in images designed to break him, to make him associate Rebecca's control with inevitable surrender. David stumbled from bed, sheets tangled around his legs, his body still trembling from the dream's aftershocks. What was wrong with him? What kind of broken thing had he become that his body could respond to that nightmare with pleasure? That he could climax while dreaming of Rebecca Torres, the woman who'd casually mentioned Sarah's murder, dominating him completely? He made it to the bathroom and vomited. Once. Twice. His stomach heaving even though there was nothing left to expel. When he finally stopped, he sat on the cold tile floor, back against the wall, trying to understand what had happened. The dream had been vague about the larger conspiracy, deliberately so, he thought. Whatever had been watching him had been careful, had shown him only fragments, impressions, just enough to mark him, to change him, but not enough to explain. But the images of Rebecca had been crystal clear, detailed, designed to imprint themselves on his psyche, to make him associate her, and by extension, their control over him, with sexual pleasure and complete submission. They were programming him, using his own biology, his own loneliness, his own desperate need for connection against him. The symbol was important. That much was clear. It represented something vast and terrible. Something that was watching, waiting. And the harder he'd tried to understand it, to decode its meaning, the worse the nightmare had become, until it had shattered into those intimate visions that his body had responded to even as his mind recoiled. David looked down at himself, at his soiled clothing, at the evidence of his body's betrayal. This was what he'd become. An exile who worked for criminals. A coward who'd never told the woman he loved how he felt. A broken thing that ejaculated during nightmares about being sexually dominated by the woman who'd murdered Sarah. Rebecca Torres had been right. He wasn't the exception. He was just another piece being moved across a board he couldn't see, responding to stimuli in exactly the ways they'd predicted. They'd mapped his psychology, his desires, his weaknesses, and they'd used all of it, the loneliness, the guilt over Sarah, the 3 years of isolation, to create a dream that would bind him more completely than any contract. David forced himself to stand, to strip off his soiled clothes, to step into the shower. The water was cold. He didn't trust himself with heat, didn't want any sensation that might feel good, might offer comfort he didn't deserve. He scrubbed his skin until it hurt, tried to wash away the terrible knowledge that his body had found pleasure in violation, that somewhere in his psyche, He wanted what Rebecca represented: the surrender, the loss of control, the terrible relief of letting someone else make all the choices. But water couldn't wash that away. Nothing could. Those images were burned into his memory now. Rebecca above him. Rebecca's hands controlling him. Rebecca's voice commanding his submission. And his body's eager response, the way even now, standing in cold water, part of him was aroused by the memory. They'd gotten inside his head, deeper than conscious thought, down to the level where desire lived, where the body made its own decisions independent of morality or survival instinct. When he finally emerged, wrapped in a towel, the morning light filtered through his window. His terminal showed that 18 hours had passed since Rebecca Torres left his office. An entire day cycle lost to desperate choices and nightmare. The apartment was silent except for the hum of life support. Martian sunlight painted the walls in shades of rust and amber. Real sunlight, not the filtered false light of the office districts. Except the nightmare hadn't felt like a nightmare. Nightmares were incoherent, fragmentary. They fell apart when you tried to remember them, dissolving into emotional residue and disconnected images. This had been different. This had been clear. Precise. As if someone had opened his skull and poured information directly into his brain while he slept. David splashed water on his face, but his hands were shaking. His entire body was shaking. They'd been in his dreams. Whoever, whatever, was behind this, they could reach into his sleeping mind and show him visions. Or maybe it was just stress. Trauma. His subconscious processing the threat Rebecca represented, the shock of Sarah's death, the weight of discovering a 4.3 trillion ISK conspiracy. Maybe the dream meant nothing. But David knew better. He'd spent his entire career finding patterns in noise. He knew the difference between coincidence and design. The dream had been designed, delivered, a message wrapped in nightmare imagery, showing him exactly what he was part of, whether he wanted to be or not. 7 pieces. 7 people being moved into position. He thought about the photograph Rebecca had left. Victor Kane. Another person investigating financial irregularities. Another piece on the board. How many others were there? How many people like him, scattered across the solar system, all finding breadcrumbs that had been left specifically for them? David checked his terminal. 3 messages waiting. The first was from his smuggling ring client, asking about the audit progress. Routine. Ignorable. The second was a news update about Sarah's death. The official investigation had concluded it was an accident. Equipment failure. No one to blame. Case closed. Clean. Efficient. As if a human life could be reduced to a bureaucratic footnote. The third message had no sender information. Just a single line of text. Welcome to the pattern, Mr. Chen. Try not to deviate. David stared at the message for a long time. No sender. No trace. Just words appearing in his system as if they'd materialized from nothing. They were watching. Always watching. He thought about Rebecca's touch on his face. About the way she'd looked at him, knowing and amused, as if he were a particularly interesting insect under glass. You're welcome to imagine you are the exception, if it makes this easier. David pulled up the contract she'd left. The data chip contained more than just the corporate audit terms. There were files, briefings, background information on the companies he'd be investigating, and schedules, specific locations, specific times, 3 weeks on Europa, 2 weeks on Ganymede, a week in the belt. Each location corresponded to one of the companies where he'd found the financial anomalies. Each one would give him deeper access to the pattern, to the web of embezzlement and coordination that was funding something. Something in the belt. Something hidden. Something that 4.3 trillion ISK was building toward. David should have deleted it all. Should have formatted his drives, destroyed his backups, walked away from this nightmare. Instead, he found himself reading the briefings, analyzing the data, already planning his investigation approach. The hook was set. He could feel it in his chest, pulling him forward. Not just Rebecca's manipulation, though that was part of it, the memory of her closeness, the way his body had responded despite his fear. But deeper than that, the fundamental need to understand. To see the pattern complete. To know what it all meant. It was the same impulse that had made him investigate Prometheus distribution 3 years ago. The same refusal to accept comfortable ignorance that had gotten him exiled to Mars. He was an analyst, a hunter of patterns, and they'd put a pattern in front of him that was bigger, more complex, more significant than anything he'd ever encountered. They'd known he wouldn't be able to resist. David accepted the contract. His hands moved across the interface, executing the acceptance protocols, transferring his digital signature, committing himself to 3 months of work that would lead him exactly where they wanted him to go. The payment appeared in his account almost instantly. 200,000 ISK. Half the contracted amount, paid up front. More than he'd made in the last year. Enough to erase his debts, upgrade his living situation, maybe even save enough to eventually leave Mars. Blood money. Payment for complicity. Payment for Sarah's death, for his cowardice, for becoming exactly what they needed him to be. But at least he'd understand before they killed him. David began packing. The first assignment was on Europa in 4 days. He'd need to book transport, arrange lodging, prepare the analytical tools he'd need for the corporate audits. All the mundane logistics of becoming a willing participant in his own destruction. His terminal chimed. Another message. This one had a sender, Rebecca Torres. I knew you'd make the right choice, Mr. Chen. Your transport to Europa is already arranged. Departure in 3 days. Try to get some rest. The real work begins soon. Below that, a final line that made David's pulse quicken despite himself. And for what it's worth, I meant what I said. You're not the exception. But I do enjoy watching you try. David closed the message and stood at his window, looking out over Olympus City. The sun was setting again, painting the dome in shades of red and orange. Another day cycle passing. Another rotation of Mars around its axis. The universe continuing its mechanical dance, indifferent to the small human dramas played out on its surface. Somewhere in the belt, for 0.3 trillion ISK, was funding something massive. Something hidden. Somewhere in deep space, 6 other people were being moved into position, following breadcrumbs that had been laid for them, unable to resist the pull of patterns they'd been selected to see. And somewhere beyond human perception, in dimensions that mathematics couldn't properly describe, something ancient was beginning to wake. David Chen had been a coalition analyst, had exposed corruption, traced money through impossible mazes, believed in truth and justice and the fundamental possibility of systemic reform. Then the system had destroyed him. Now he was being given a second chance. Not at redemption. There was no redemption in this. But at understanding. At seeing the shape of things before the end. It would have to be enough. David turned from the window and began his preparations in earnest. 3 days until Europa. 3 days to organize his thoughts, secure his backups, make whatever peace he could with the choices that had led him here. 3 days until he stepped fully into the trap that had been carefully, patiently constructed around him. The pattern was forming. The pieces were moving. And David Chen was no longer sure where his will ended and their manipulation began. The presence was still out there, still watching, still waiting. But whoever they were, whatever they wanted, they remained silent. Elsewhere on a small moon orbiting Jupiter, in a location that didn't officially exist, a monitoring station clings to Jia's surface like a frozen growth, its hull scarred by 8 millennia of micrometeorite wounds and radiation bleaching. Inside, a chamber stretches in hexagonal symmetry, 12 console stations rising from the deck like sarcophagi, their screens opaque with crystalline frost. 3 chairs wait in the silence, mounted on recessed tracks that web the floor in silver lattice, rails furred with dust fine as crematory ash. 1 chair faces navigation. 1 rests at communications. The third is frozen mid-transit, rotated between stations as though its occupant rose and simply vanished. The seats are contoured for bodies not quite human. Dust shrouds everything in pale funeral layers. The cold is absolute, not winter's cold, but the cold of endings. Above, Jupiter's great red spot remains burned into the dead ceiling display, a cyclopean eye watching over this tomb. There are no bodies. That is somehow worse. The chairs can still move. When tested, they glide with frictionless precision, cutting dark furrows through the dust like the marks of dragged fingers. Then a flicker. 1 monitor illuminates. Green text scrolls across ancient glass. Asterisk subject, Chen David. Behavioral assessment in progress, asterisk. Stress response, within predicted parameters. Emotional vulnerability, exploitable. Pattern recognition capability, exceptional. Resistance to manipulation, minimal. Asterisk note, subject remains unaware of tertiary surveillance. Torres syndicate and primary conspiracy both believe subject under their exclusive observation. This misconception is strategically useful, asterisk. Asterisk recommendation, continue passive monitoring. Do not interfere with current manipulation vectors. Subject's trajectory aligns with organizational requirements. Asterisk. Report was received. Acknowledged. Filed. And in the vast darkness beyond human comprehension, something ancient and patient noted that another piece was moving into position. The pattern was forming. The trap was closing. And none of the players, not Rebecca Torres, not the conspiracy she served, not David Chen himself, understood that they were all being watched by something far older than human ambition. Something that had been waiting a very long time. Something that was finally beginning to wake. The end of Chapter 2. David Chen has stepped into the trap. Rebecca Torres has marked him. On a dead station orbiting Jupiter's moon. Yeah, something watches them all. A third player, observing conspiracies within conspiracies. 7 locks, 7 keys, 7 people. Kira and Marcus in the belt, David on Mars, Amara on Europa. The pattern is forming, and something ancient is waking. But first, 6 days before Ganymede, another player enters the game. Kareem Campbell, legally dead, information broker, about to intercept files that will change everything. Until next time, some doors were meant to stay closed.